question this week is a bit of a long one, so bear with me. This one comes from Jay, asking about volume training blocks. My current FTP is 290, and I'd like to get it up to 320 within the next year. Overall, I'm not sure if a 30-watt FTP improvement in 1 year is doable, but my mindset is centered around exploring this goal with curiosity. For the past year, I've been averaging 8.5 hours a week, with a couple weeks in the year seeing 10 to 11 hours. I currently operate under a 3-2-2 principle. 3 days of endurance, 2 days of intensity, and 2 days completely off. I do a 3-1 macro cycle, 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Lately, I've been hitting a plateau, which I believe is attributed to my volume. In a recent episode, it was discussed adding more volume to get out of that plateau. How do I successfully execute a volume block to help me get out of this plateau, and what does that look like? Some things I need clarification and advice on. Do I just adjust volume from, say, 10 to 15 hours for 1 week? Or do I try to go from 10 hours in 1 week to 15 hours over a 3-week period? Do I approach a volume week where the volume is the stress/intensity? Meaning I don't need to do any sweet spot threshold intervals that week because that increase in volume will be enough stress on the body. If I do a 1 week volume block, say 15 hours, I'm open to it being more than that if there's a better rule of thumb. Do I need a recovery week after that? If I went with the approach of 15-hour week, does it matter how I structure that week? Should I do the hours in 5 consecutive days or space it out throughout the week? Then he gives some information. Let's see. He's working a full-time job, 3 kids under 9 years old, doing some form of structured training since 2012. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's enough as far as context goes. Tactically, I plan on taking some time off work to execute this block to get over the plateau. Thanks, Jay. So,
wow.
Yeah. Let me read this other one quick, too. Okay.
Question?
Another question?
Well, because it's
crazy.
That was already such a question already.
I know, but they're both related because they're both follow-ups from a recent volume block that we were talking about. So I want to kind of just be able to cover all of it with one discussion, so we don't have to read the second question and then touch on it again.
Okay.
Because this one comes from Mikey G, and it's very similar. So I want to be able to just cover everything. So Mikey G says, on last week's podcast, you discussed some aspects of doing a volume block before a main event. I'm writing today with questions to clarify some specifics. How much extra volume should a high volume week include? I'm talking 150 to 200%. What is the sweet spot? And then where would you space that out as far as like timeout from the event? And then last question, whether a 7-day high volume period is good enough, maybe 3 days on and such and such. So the reason I want to read that, so we're kind of covering it from 2 different perspectives here. So Jay in the first question is kind of wondering what could he do to incorporate a volume training block into his training to help get him out of a plateau. But then the contrary to that is we have Mikey G who wants to know implementing kind of a similar strategy, but for peaking for an event. So, and I think there are 2 different approaches. And I think the way that you would structure what that training block looks like depends on what your approach is and what your goals are for that volume block. So that's why I want to read both of those. So let's get into it.
Where do we start?
Maybe we start with volume blocks.
Yeah, well, okay, so
dang, Dylan, you hit the nail on the head. You got all these people excited about this new revolutionary style of training, a volume block.
I'm gonna get them even more excited about it when I do my next video.
Great.
That's all I'll say about it. That's all I'll say about it.
Dang.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I think there's a lot to get excited about. Like, I think if you're in a situation like these people find themselves in where you're hitting a plateau, I think it can legitimately get you over a plateau. And I mean, I guess I feel like the last time I was on here, we talked all about volume blocks, but we can talk about it again. You know, so the first person is doing 8 to 10 hours a week, and they're thinking about doing 15.
15. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, I mean, there's a difference between just raising your volume to try to improve your performance and doing a volume block. You could also just try to overall raise your volume. I don't know if your schedule allows for that. Like if you're doing 8 to 10, maybe try to go to 10 to 12. Just in, an average.
Consistently,
Consistently, right? That's that could also get you over the hump for sure.
That's what I was going to suggest. It's like, I think that the first guy, Jay, I would even maybe suggest that before the volume block. Like, a volume block is something that you do occasionally, but if there's something that you can do week in and week out to be making gains, then do that. And so if you can add 3 hours to your training and go from 9 hours to 12 hours, that would be a huge increase, I think, like, to do that week in and week out.
So Jay I don't remember Jay saying whether or not that's a possibility. I don't know if Jay's current schedule allows for 3 extra hours. And the reason why he's even bringing up a volume block is because he's going to need to take off work anyway. So he might as well go all in.
There's 127 hours in a week. He's got 3 more hours.
I know, that's what we always say when somebody gives us this question. It's like, just make more time.
Yeah.
But I agree with you, Drew. Like, I think that you could certainly try a volume block if you are, if you're at a lower volume already. But I think that the first thing to do, because I feel like Jay hasn't ticked every single box, and I almost feel like volume block is like a very advanced training method that you should try when you've ticked every box, if that makes sense.
Volume block is kind of like that guy that we were talking about on the Bonk Bros with the funny glasses, trying to get you to do that 5-minute workout to increase your VO2 by 12%.
No, it's not, dude. No, it's not.
It's like, what a gimmick. Like, bro,
it's not a gimmick. You have to do actual work to do it. It's not going to take you 5 minutes. It's going to take you 30 plus hours.
Opposite of what he said.
No, it's not. It's not a gimmick. It's like.
But
I don't know how to.
The point I was trying to make is people see something shiny and they want to do that. And I'm like, but the shiny thing isn't always the best thing. Like the new volume block or the 5-minute increase your VO2 by 12%, that crazy guy. Like, just because it sounds awesome doesn't necessarily mean that you should do that. Like, yeah, maybe Dylan should do that, but I'm like, I mean, I think what's tried and true and the just straight up periodization and increase your weekly volume, like that isn't shiny, but it'll probably work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't really want people to get the impression that volume block is like some magical key that they've been missing from their training, and if they could only just add a volume block in, then that would solve all their problems. Certainly not going to be the case. And I think that in certain cases, like the case that Jay is in, I'm in agreement with you, Drew. I think that if he were to just add volume to his normal training week, in the form of an extra 2 or 3 hours, I actually think that would go further than doing a 15-hour volume block that he's thinking about doing.
Agreed.
His ultimate goal is to increase his FCP 30 watts in a year. So doing one volume block is not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's a very good point.
Over
Caitlin.
10.
What's his goal? How do we get there?
Yeah, I do think for someone that's very new into their training, that you could see some kind of sizable bump like that. But I think Jay mentions that he's been training for over 12 years, structured training since 2012. So a seasoned athlete like that, the benefits you're going to get from a big week like that, or you're just not going to see 10%. You're going to need to have that consistent overload week after week.
You know what I'll do? It's not necessarily like Dylan probably wouldn't categorize this as a volume block, but he talks about his 3 on, 1 off, and where you train 3 weeks, take a rest week. And I always try to make that 3rd week more volume, and I will try to make it like a significant jump in volume because I have a rest week the next week. So I may not go from like 20 hours to 40 hours like what Dylan was talking about in a high volume block, but I might go from 20 to try to get to maybe, well, I might go from like 25 to like a little over 30 and like try to increase it. So like what he's saying, going from 10 to 15, like he could potentially just do that in his standard training where he does 10 hours, and then just make that 3rd week a 15-hour.
So you're saying trying to do that consistently then. So like, more than one
time. Yeah. Or even do like a 10, 12, 15.
Yeah. I mean, it might be tough because again, he mentions having to take time off work in order to do this 15-hour week, which that was one thing I was going to mention. Like if you're going to take time off work,
do more.
You better get more than 15 hours.
Yeah. That's kind of where I was going.
Put in 25 hours, put in a full work week,
Yeah.
I also don't really think I don't see 15 hours as a volume block.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
maybe
thought-
it's a volume block if you trained 3 to 5 hours a week, but a volume block is such a significant increase in your volume that it requires, for example, he was asking if it requires a rest week afterwards. It definitely requires a
sure.
rest week afterwards. It should be enough volume that you need the rest week afterwards. I mean, for example, I'm typically training 20 to 25 hours a week, and I'm to the point where a volume block to me is over 35 hours, pushing 40 hours. So if you're training 10 hours a week, I wouldn't necessarily classify it as a volume block until you're up over 20.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah, that's where I thought we were headed. So,
So
I knew you were gonna say that.
I don't know if we answered every question of his because there were a lot of questions, but
Yeah.
Well, so
Oh, I did have another thing.
So, I mean, what he did ask for some more clarification on what the structure of that volume week would look like. So maybe Dylan, just so the people, and you might have done this in one of your training videos, I'm not sure, but for our listeners, why don't you just give us like an example of what a normal training week would look like, and then compare that to what one of your volume block weeks look like?
Sure. I mean, I can just do it for the average person. It doesn't necessarily have to be one of mine, but
For sure, yeah.
so he says that he does 3 days of endurance, 2 days of intensity, 2 rest days. That's pretty typical. That's what I prescribe to a lot of people. So that might be like Monday rest day, Tuesday intervals, Wednesday endurance, Thursday rest day, Friday intervals, Saturday, Sunday endurance, something like that, right? Which is pretty typical. And you can have that exact same structure for a volume block. Although usually I will only do, to try to get in more volume, I will only have 1 rest day in the volume block. So the way I would typically structure it is, in a 7-day period, you've got 2 3-day chunks, and then you've got the day in the middle is the rest day. So if you were to go, you don't have to do it from Monday to Sunday, but if you were to do it from Monday to Sunday, it would be, Monday on, Tuesday on, Wednesday on, Thursday off, Friday, Saturday, Sunday on.
Chase Work told me that's how he does his 40-hour weeks. He does 6.5 hours every day of the week, except for one day in the middle, he'll do a 1-hour easy spin, and that gets him 40 hours. And they're just 6.5 hours endurance every day.
So he won't do any intensity, you're saying?
0 intensity.
And what about you, Dylan? So what are your thoughts on intensity?
So I have done tempo in a volume block. Like the lead up to Unbound, I did tempo in my volume block.
And then
I wouldn't necessarily advise going, what'd you say?
And then you got sick.
Yeah, and then I got 10th. So
all part of the equation.
So anyway, so I wouldn't necessarily, if it's your first volume block, I would not necessarily advise doing that. I would take the cautious route and maybe just make the entire thing zone 2 or less. But and I also, if you want to add intensity to your volume block, I wouldn't necessarily do VO2 max intervals. Like I would probably stick within the tempo range, and those tempo workouts you shouldn't be doing so much tempo that you're smoked afterwards, because you've already got a lot of training stress coming at you just from the sheer volume of the week. But yeah, if it's your first volume block, I would probably just make the entire week zone 2 and just get in a lot of zone 2. Probably at least double what you're used to.
Yeah, and when you say zone 2, you mean real zone 2. So that can be challenging in itself for a lot of people. So you have to just be mindful that if you're going to do a volume block, you have to make those quality and zone 2 rides. You can't go out and end up spending 20% of your time in threshold above, organically. Like you got to try and hit zone 2, because that's a lot of times people can get away with that because they're only training 6 to 10 hours. But when you're putting 20 plus hours in, like it has to be pretty controlled when you're doing those zone 2 rides.
Yeah, absolutely. Zone 2, like intensity control and staying in zone 2 is always important in my opinion. But I think if it's ever more important than any other time, it would be during a volume block.
Especially during the first time, I feel like you want to the first time you're doing a volume block, you want to make sure you're doing just zone 2, because you want to know at the end of it, did this volume block work for you? And the only way you're going to know is if you eliminate other variables. So like smoked after this volume block, well, I only did zone 2. I know it's from the increase in volume. It wasn't from me riding too hard.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I've got a question for you guys. So let's stay focused on Jay for right now. Jay's trying to get himself out of this plateau and, looking to increase his FTP by up to 10% over the next year. He specifically talks about, including this volume block as part of his training as a way to get out of the plateau. What are your thoughts of like when someone should consider doing a volume block versus an intensity block? Block week.
Just never do an intensity block and do a couple, and then do these high volume blocks in the base season. There you go.
Your advice is to never do an intensity block.
Yeah, I just think they're too risky.
Okay. All right.
I'm
Personally have not had good luck with them, right? True.
Yeah. I've only done it like once really and didn't really care for it. I would rather just get in 3 good weeks of consistent training than one crazy week.
Yeah, but in this case here, it's Jay's not talking about any events specifically. He does mention he's doing some I think like, longer duration events maybe. No, the ultimate goal is climbing Haleakala. So in Hawaii. So like that's not even, I don't know, Jay can wait to do that till he feels fit enough, right? There's like nothing riding on that. So
Yeah. No,
So I mean, to your point, Adam, I was going to basically say a similar thing. Whether or not you should choose block periodization with intensity or block periodization with volume should depend on what you're training for. If you're training for Unbound or something similar to that, where you're going to be riding your bike for a long time, I think that block periodization with volume makes more sense. If you're training for crits, or you're training for cyclocross, or you're training for cross country mountain bike, or something that's short and punchy, I would do potentially try block periodization with intensity. I think that honestly, block periodization with intensity or block periodization with volume could work for events that are not necessarily similar to what you're doing. But I think if you're gonna experiment with it and you're gonna try it for the first time, it just makes more sense for the block to fit with what you're training for.
So that could be another option here. So if let's say Jay can do what I think what our unanimous advice would be, which is increase your volume from 8.5 hours to 10 hours on a weekly basis. Like if you could do that,
12,
whatever. let's just say increase it by 10 15%, something like that. 10 to 20% maybe. If you could do that on a consistent basis, that's probably going to get you that 30 watts that you won't get from a volume block. But if you also want to just kind of like get yourself out of this rut, let's say you can't do the increase your volume right now, or it's going to take some time for you to get an increase in volume consistently, you could try, without even adjusting your schedule at all, an intensity block with your 8.5 hours that you have, and see if that gets you out of it. Again, it's kind of like experimentation. You don't give us a huge timeline. We're just working with a year here, so like you've got time to do both of these approaches or all three of the approaches if you really wanted to. But this could be a way, like that's kind of what I like about the intensity blocks sometimes, is they're just more feasible for people. Not everyone can take that 2x volume block and implement that into their training, but an intensity block usually is going to be about the same volume or maybe even less than your typical volume. So that could be something you try here just to see, maybe that pulls you out of that plateau you're seeing, gives you, 10 watts to work with, and then you can, take off from there. One other thing I want to mention too, Jay mentions, and I don't know if this is just talking about generic week or if this is part of his quote unquote like typical structured week, but he does mention he does 1 day of sweet spot and then 1 day of threshold or VO2 max training. I don't know if you're just always doing that, but if you're always doing the same intensity style and giving your body the same stimulus, you're also going to reach a plateau. So hopefully Jay's periodizing what types of intensity he's including into his training.
That's what I was going to say earlier, was like, I can't tell if he just gave us like a snapshot or if that's what he does every week. Because if that's what he does every week, if you do the same thing, you're going to stay the same. Come on. And if you're just doing the same workouts week in and week out, like, yeah, you're going to plateau. That's just reality. So yeah, what you said, doing it in a periodized structure, like there should be at points where he's even going harder than VO2, where he's doing like full on power intervals or 30-30s or whatever. Like that's a part of the whole periodization process. So if you're only ever getting up to like threshold, then you're missing out on a lot of good workouts that could be getting you out of a plateau. The other thing I was going to mention was people have been doing high volume weeks for forever. We call them training camps. And I am doing a training camp in Tennessee on March the 20th to the 24th. This will be like the third or fourth year that I've done it under the Ignition umbrella. You can sign up, the sign up sheets right on the Ignition website. You can find it on my social medias. 5 days of riding, 4 days in the cabin. It's a lot of fun. It's beautiful down there. Dylan came, I think, 2 years ago and rode with us a couple days. Maybe I'll convince him to come up and ride with us a couple more days this year.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. That's like my training spot. Like if I've got like 3 or 4 days of nothing going on, that's where I'll go, because it's like a 4.5 hour drive from my house, and it's like amazing riding down there. Not that much traffic. So yeah, it's always a good time.
I did have one of my international athletes request that a future camp be located closer to an international airport.
If you fly into the Knoxville airport, it personally can pick you up because it's
Is that
only
an
like
international airport?
Probably not, but it
Even better.
probably connects to an international airport.
Is Phoenix an international airport? I think it is, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
even better. Flagstaff altitude training camp done.
Well, we could do it. Somebody just has to lead the ship.
What is the altitude at Flagstaff again? You guys
7,000.
7,000.
7. You can
That's like pretty ideal.
ride up
International people
Snowball
are going to need
Road
to
and
know that in meters, though.
When I read a book
2,000
on
meters,
something,
2,200
it said
meters.
22.
as far as like places to train, Flagstaff and Mammoth, California were like the two cities that it said were like optimal elevation.
It's a hub for runners, for
there's
triathletes.
A lot of
There's
pro
a
runners
lot
coming
of
to
there's a
Mammoth.
lot of places in the U.S. that are optimal elevation.
Yeah, no, I know, but a lot of
No,
pro
you know
runners
why?
have come out of Mammoth Lakes, California. Like a lot.
Let me back this up for a second, because you can really do the train low, live high.
Sleep high, train low.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you can drop down the mountain of Sedona.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You can't do that.
not
Like
even-
in the Front Range of Colorado, the lowest you're going to get is still going to be 5,000 feet.
Sick.
I think in Verde Valley
Yeah, I
you can
don't
be at
think-
like 2,500 feet.
Yeah, I think in Townsend, there's no elevation. But I think we climb up to 5,000 feet on one of the rides. Just because
So
one of the
the-
roads goes
basically
up
the
5,000
opposite.
feet.
And train,
Pretty much.
that's fine though. I mean, like you don't really need to do an altitude camp in March. You
Yeah,
need a
yeah, it's-
volume camp.
This is more of a volume camp than it is, yeah.
We only got a few more minutes, but let's focus on finishing up Mikey G's question about volume blocks.
All
So it's the other side of the equation, which is using a volume block to peak for an event. So Dylan, this is a little bit closer to what you've, been able to implement, or at least you implemented last year. What are your recommendations as far as timing? How far out from that event you would want to see that volume block placed? And you did 2 weeks, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 2 weeks instead of 1 week. I think it depends on how crazy you're going with the volume block. So a 2-week volume block needs more recovery time. And the higher the volume, the more recovery time you need too. But
Well, did you get a new tattoo?
I was just going to say that too.
we can't talk about that right now. We're
That's
talking
just
about
right. You just lifted your arm up and it's all
Like
new
a-
tattoo.
like
talking
wing-
about training
the
right
wings
now,
of an
dude.
eagle
Whoa.
over there.
Come on, let me see that thing.
No. We're talking about training right now. Adam's got like 3 minutes left, dude.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
We'll talk about it on Bonk Bros.
Okay.
Just jot in your notes. Anyway, so what was I even saying?
Out from an event, are you placing the volume block?
So I think if it's just 1 week and like let's say you usually do 10 hours a week and you're doing 20, so you're doubling your volume and you're only doing 1 week. I think that 2 weeks between the end of the block and the race is probably the shortest amount of time you want to go. You could go longer than that if you're worried that you're not going to be able to recover. But I think 2 weeks is probably fine. If you're doing something crazier than that, where like you do even more volume than that, or you're doing a 2 week volume block, I would end it 3 weeks out. And that first week back should be a pretty easy week, like mostly low volume, low intensity, zone 1, low zone 2 rides. But you don't want to just do that all the way up till race day. You do want to get in some intensity before race day so you don't have flat legs on race day. So for example, if you're doing 2 weeks between the end of your volume block and the race, I would chill after the volume block, and then that weekend before the race, get in some intensity, get in a little bit of volume, and then do a normal taper week into the race. If you're doing 3 weeks, I would chill the week after the volume block. The next week, so the week that's 2 weeks out, you could kind of have be more or less a normal training week, depending on how you feel. If you're still tired, rest more. If you feel fine, maybe make it a normal training week, and then last week is taper week.
That makes sense. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap on volume training blocks.
I think my 2025 plan is to just every week is going to be a training of a volume week. Every week.
I was going to suggest that in one of the upcoming episodes, we should do a 2025 kind of like goal setting and, like either goals, like come with some of our own goals, but then also like how do we approach like what it what it looks like to set goals, but then also like maybe some planning that we have for 2025, like what you might try to include in some training, because I have some interesting thoughts of things that I'm going to try and include into my training next year.
If we talk about our goals on the podcast, that would be.
I know. Then we got to hold true.
We got to do it. Yeah, we got to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's part of goal setting.
So keep that in mind. For probably either next week or the week after.
Yeah,
all right.
Should do that.
Cool.
Real quick though, I do think both Jay and Mikey G should get coaches. Drew started to touch on this, but we can give our best educated advice, but unless we really know the athlete, we can't give our truly best advice for them. I mean, if I could say, if you want to do an intensity workout, do 30-30s, but if I give, someone gives Drew 30-30s, somebody gives me 30-30s, I would say you could make the argument both ways. Like, Drew might need less recovery than me because he's more adapted, but Drew might need more recovery than me because he was able to go harder in that workout. So like it really depends on the person. I mean, the same is true with nutrition. Like Drew was saying, like there's no shiny workout, there's no fad diet. Like if you look at a continuous glucose monitor and Drew eats rice and Caitlin eats rice, they're going to have different responses to the same food. Like it's always, there's no blanket program. So the best way to figure out what's right for you is to hire a coach.
Yeah, then that way,
Merry Christmas, everybody.
If it goes bad, you've got someone to blame, and you can just fire your coach. And
and if it goes great, you can give them a bonus. You just give your coach a bonus. I'm sure they'll take it. Yeah, and I think we got a coupon code, Flame150. If you're hearing this and you enter that into the athlete form, we'll take $150 off your first month. It's like a Black Friday deal, but I've just been like rolling with it. I'm like, if you still want to use it, you can.
It's great, especially for listeners that are tuning in each week. Yeah.
Flame 150.
All right, cool. I got to run.
Cool.
We'll see you guys.
All right. See ya.